I'm Elizabeth Monroe, 31 years old, and the morning I found out my sister had sold my grandmother's condo without my consent, the world seemed to tilt just slightly out of place. My coffee had barely cooled on the counter when my lawyer's voice came through the line, steady and apologetic. The property was gone, signed, sealed, transferred, my name erased as neatly as if it had never been written. For a moment I simply stared at the window, watching raindrops trace slow lines down the glass, wondering how something built on love could vanish with a single forged signature. By the time the call ended, I wasn't angry. I was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to fight to be seen by your own family. I grew up on the outskirts of Tampa, in a house that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and competition. My parents believed in appearances, the right clothes, the right friends, the right college. My older sister Melissa understood that language perfectly. She was the kind of daughter who made family pride, easy charm poise, and the sort of confidence that turned every room toward her. I, on the other hand, loved Quiet Corners sketchbooks and the company of our grandmother Evelyn. Where others saw a shy child, she saw possibility. She'd pour us both a cup of lavender tea on her balcony and tell me that grace isn't something you perform, it's something you practice, even when no one applauds. Grandma's condo overlooked the bay where the water caught every sunset in 100 shades of gold. It wasn't fancy, not compared to the houses Melissa liked to show off online, but it was warm in a way that homes rarely are. The walls still carried the scent of sea salt and her favorite soap, and the old ceiling fan hummed a rhythm I can still hear if I close my eyes. That place was her sanctuary, and in her final letter she called it our place to breathe. When she passed, she left the deed to me, written in her own looping cursive, her final vote of confidence in the granddaughter who never fit the family mold. In the months after the funeral, I thought Melissa was simply being helpful. She wore soft colors and spoke in calm tones, taking charge of arrangements, greeting relatives, balancing folders on her lap like she was born to manage grief. I thanked her for it. I truly did. But looking back, I see the details I missed: the way she avoided eye contact when the will was mentioned, how she brushed off questions about the estate as paperwork, Grandma already sorted. At the time, I didn't question her. I had just moved to Seattle, started working at a small design firm, and told myself distance would finally make our relationship easier. Mom still called on Sundays. Her voice always seemed lighter when she talked about Melissa. "Your sister's doing so well," she'd say. "You should take notes from her." I'd listen smiling into the phone and change the subject. There was no point reminding her that success can't be measured in dinner parties or bank statements. I'd left that world behind, or so I thought. The call from Douglas Hayes came almost a year later, early on a gray Tuesday morning. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice tight with disbelief, "I need you to sit down. The condo's been sold." At first I didn't understand. Sold by whom? Your sister handled the paperwork. But there are irregularities. His words hung there cold and certain. Irregularities. It sounded so tidy, so harmless, but what he meant was something much worse. Forgery, theft, betrayal. I remember setting the phone down and walking to the window. The rain outside blurred the skyline until the city looked like a watercolor running down the page. My reflection stared back, faint and tired, as if waiting for me to decide what to do. For years I'd been the quiet one, the peacekeeper who swallowed hurt for the sake of keeping the family from splintering. But that morning, with the sky pressing low and the city muted by weather, I felt something new stir inside me. A slow, steady awareness that silence had never protected me. It had only protected them. That was the moment I realized my grandmother hadn't just left me a piece of property. She'd left me a test of courage. And whether Melissa meant to or not, she had just forced me to take it. The first message came not long after. A simple line from an unknown number. "You've been asking questions." No punctuation, no signature. I remember staring at the screen until my heartbeat matched the rhythm of the rain outside. Whoever sent it underestimated me just like everyone else had. I didn't know it then, but that message was the line dividing everything that came before from everything that came after. Because from that day on, every secret my sister had buried was about to surface, and she would learn exactly how dangerous a quiet woman can become. When the message came through, "You've been asking questions." I stared at it until the words blurred into the light of my phone. The number was blocked. The tone clipped, but I knew where it came from. That night, I barely slept. The rain beat against the windows steady and cold, while my laptop screen glowed in the dark. I opened every folder tied to my grandmother's estate emails, scanned documents, even the copy of her will that Douglas had sent after the funeral. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Grandma's signature on the original will was soft and slanted, her hand still steady at 78. The one on the sale document was stiffer, pressed too hard into the paper. Melissa always wrote like that. She liked to leave a mark, as if pressing harder could make her words more important. Douglas called early the next morning. His voice was calm but edged with disbelief. "Liz, the notary stamp doesn't match the registry," he said, "and the deed transfer was filed 2 days before the recorded sale." I stood by the window, still in my robe, the city outside wrapped in gray. "So she forged it?" I asked. He hesitated for a beat. "That's what it looks like. But don't confront her yet. Let me gather everything we need before we move." I promised I'd stay quiet, though the silence already felt heavy on my tongue. I spent the next few hours comparing everything I had, every loop of my grandmother's handwriting, every letter she ever sent me. My desk filled with papers, old photos, and coffee mugs. I remembered her telling me once, "If someone steals from you, they're not taking what's yours. They're showing who they are." I whispered that line under my breath as I traced the signatures side by side. Melissa's version was nearly perfect. Nearly. The difference sat in the smallest detail. Grandma's lowercase g always ended with a flourish. Melissa's stopped short. That tiny slip would undo her entire lie. By the time evening came, I sent Douglas everything I had, photos, comparisons, a short message that said she thought I wouldn't notice. Then I shut the laptop and sat in the quiet. Outside, the streetlights shimmered against the rain, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like running. I was done being the sister who stayed silent. The next morning, my phone lit up again, Melissa's name across the screen. I stared at it until the ringing stopped, but it started again a minute later. I answered on the third try. "Sis." Her voice burst through, bright and breathless. "You won't believe how busy I've been. I finally sold Grandma's condo, closed the deal last week." My throat tightened. "You sold it?" "Yep," she said cheerfully. "Cash offer, $320 even. The realtor said I handled it like a pro." I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, smooth and practiced. "I wanted to thank you for not getting in the way. I know legal stuff overwhelms you." I didn't answer. I just listened to the rain through the glass and the sound of her voice unraveling everything that had ever felt safe. "And hey," she added lightly, "I'm sending you $10,000 next week. Thought you could use a little help with rent up there." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Melissa." I said slowly, "That condo was mine." She laughed, the same laugh that used to echo through our house whenever she'd won another argument. "Oh, come on. Grandma wanted it for both of us. You're living your dream in Seattle. I handled things here. For the family." Her words hung in the air like smoke. I could almost see her sitting in her perfect kitchen, her nails clicking against a coffee cup, certain I'd swallow it the way I always had. But I didn't. "You forged her signature," I said quietly. The line went still. Then her tone sharpened. "Watch it, Liz. You don't know what you're talking about." "Douglas found inconsistencies," I said. "The stamps don't match. The handwriting doesn't either." She gave a soft laugh, one that didn't reach her voice. "You're being dramatic again. Maybe your lawyer's trying to make more money. Don't embarrass yourself." Before I could reply, the call clicked off. I stood there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the window. The rain had started again, harder now, tracing crooked lines down the glass. I replayed her words in my head, every denial, every careful dodge, and pressed record on my phone. Then I called her back. When her voicemail picked up, I saved the message and forwarded it to Douglas. Her arrogance had just given me my first piece of proof. That night, I opened a new folder on my computer and named it Evidence. One by one, I added everything: emails, the recording, the handwriting samples. I worked until the clock on my wall read past midnight, until the rain faded into a soft, distant hum. By the time I closed my laptop, I had stopped shaking. There was something steady in me now. Not anger, not grief, just focus. Mom called the following evening. Her voice was light at first, the way it always was when she wanted something to sound simple. "Sweetheart, I just spoke to your sister," she said. "She told me she sold Grandma's place. It's such a relief to have that handled." I sat down, gripping the edge of my desk. "Handled. She's been working so hard," Mom continued. "You should be proud of her. Did she tell you who inherited it?" There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. She said it was divided equally. "You know how you get about these things, Liz. Please don't start drama." Her voice softened. "Just let it go." When the line went dead, I stared at the silent phone. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was how easily they believed her, how quickly they dismissed me as the emotional one. But that was fine. Let them believe what they wanted. This time I wouldn't fight with words. I'd fight with proof. 3 days later, Douglas called again. "The fraud report's been filed," he said. "The court issued a freeze on the sale proceeds. Melissa's about to find out." I thanked him quietly and hung up. Within hours, my phone started buzzing. 10 missed calls, then 15. I let them ring until the notifications filled the screen like falling dominoes. On the 20th, I answered. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "I don't know," I said evenly. "Why don't you tell me? Don't play dumb, Liz." "The bank froze my account this morning. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't do anything," I replied. The truth did. For a moment, all I could hear was her breathing on the other end. Then a low, bitter laugh. "You think you can ruin me? You're delusional. You stole what Grandma left me." "No," I said, steady now. "You forged her name and pocketed the money. You're just getting the consequences." Her voice cracked. "Please, you were never responsible enough to manage that place. I handled it for the family the way I always do." "You should thank me," she hissed, "for keeping you from embarrassing yourself." "By stealing from me?" I asked. She didn't answer. "You live in another country, sketching logos and drinking lattes. You don't deserve that condo." Something inside me went still. "And you do?" I asked quietly. "Someone had to act like an adult," she said. Then she hung up. The silence after her voice disappeared was heavier than anything she'd said. I set my phone down and watched the city through the rain. The quiet no longer felt like surrender. It felt like strategy. I opened the evidence folder and began to type notes, labeling every file, every call, every line of proof that pointed back to her. This time, I wasn't just collecting information. I was building a reckoning. The next morning, the phone rang again. The name on the screen made me hesitate, Mom. I almost ignored it, but guilt pulled my thumb across the glass. "Elizabeth, what's going on?" she demanded before I could speak. "Melissa's in tears. She says you filed a fraud case. Tell me that isn't true." "It's true," I said quietly. "She forged Grandma's documents." "Don't be ridiculous," Mom said sharply. "Your sister would never. She's been so responsible. Mom, this isn't emotion. It's evidence," I said, steadying my voice. Douglas verified the signatures. "And I have her admitting it on the phone." There was a long silence, then her tone softened to disappointment. "You recorded your sister?" "Yes," I said, "because no one ever believes me unless I prove it." The call ended with her sigh, a sound I'd known since childhood, the one that meant, "You're the problem again." I sat there until the line went silent. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world felt clearer, sharper, as if the air itself had taken sides. 2 nights later, my phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I almost silenced it until I saw the name Ethan Carter, Melissa's husband. I hesitated before answering. His voice came through low and tired. "Liz, I hope I'm not crossing a line," he said, "but you deserve to know the truth." I didn't speak. He kept going. "I didn't know what she did. She told me you'd given up your claim, and I didn't ask questions. But after the bank froze the account, I checked. She forged everything, the will, the notary, all of it. Said you wouldn't notice from out of state." He took a breath. She spent part of the money on a new house. It's gone." The room went still around me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I can't lie for her anymore," he said. "I'll testify if it goes to court." When the call ended, I sat in the quiet, the glow from the streetlight flickering across my desk. For the first time, I felt something close to peace. The truth had begun to surface, and it wasn't just mine anymore. By the next morning, Douglas confirmed Ethan's statement. "He's cooperating," he said. "We have enough to press forward. The buyers are testifying too. If we move now, it's airtight." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Do it." And as I hung up, I knew that this was only the beginning, the part where silence would finally speak louder than all their excuses combined. The morning after Douglas confirmed Ethan's cooperation, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The city outside was still half asleep, the light thin and gray. My phone sat face down beside me, silent for the first time in days. For the first time since this started, I felt like I could breathe without waiting for the next call or excuse. The stillness didn't feel peaceful, it felt suspended, as if the world was holding its breath with me. Douglas called again before noon. "Liz," he said, his voice brisk but calm, "we've got enough to move forward. The buyers confirmed the payment trail and Ethan's statement seals it." He paused. "The next step is filing the injunction to return the property to your name." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Do it," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Douglas. It was Melissa. Her name glowed against the screen, followed by another, then another. By the fifth call, I picked up. Her tone was sharp, nothing like the syrupy calm she'd used before. "What the hell did you do, Liz?" she snapped. "The bank froze my account. My realtor's panicking. You've ruined everything." I leaned back in my chair, watching the clouds drift over the skyline. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." She laughed, but the sound was jagged. "You think you can make me the villain? You're delusional. You've always been jealous of me. Admit it." Her voice cracked, the first hint of fear breaking through the anger. "You can't just take this from me." "I'm not taking anything," I said. "I'm taking back what was already mine." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then her tone dropped to a whisper. "You were never responsible enough to handle that condo. Grandma knew it. Mom knew it. I was protecting you from yourself." The call ended with a click. I stared at the silent phone, my pulse steady. For years, I'd let her rewrite every story we shared, who was right, who was loved more, who deserved what. But now the paper trail told the truth better than either of us ever could. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for the first time in days. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets damp and shining. I walked to the park down the block and sat on a bench beneath a maple tree. A woman jogged past with her dog, a family shared sandwiches by the fountain, and somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. It all felt distant, but grounding. My grandmother's words came back to me like a whisper. If someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I had spent years pretending Melissa would change. Now I finally believed her. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, scrolling through old photos, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. In every picture, Melissa stood front and center, smiling like the world belonged to her. I was always somewhere on the edge, holding a plate, carrying something half-cropped out of the frame. Grandma was the only one who ever noticed. She'd squeeze my hand and say, "You're not invisible, Liz. You're just surrounded by people who refuse to look." The next morning, Mom called again. I almost didn't answer. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice tight. "Your sister's beside herself. She says you've humiliated her." I closed my eyes. "Mom," she forged Grandma's signature. "That's not humiliation, that's fraud." "You don't understand," Mom said quickly. "She's been under so much stress. The new house, the mortgage." She stopped short, realizing too late what she'd revealed. "The what I asked." "Mom," I said slowly, "did she use the money from the condo to buy a new house?" Silence. Then softly, "She told us it was an inheritance from Ethan's uncle." I exhaled, pressing my palm to my forehead. "Mom," She lied. Ethan already confirmed it. "You talked to her husband," she said, her voice rising. "Elizabeth, that's private family business. You shouldn't drag outsiders into this." I didn't argue. There was no point. I just said, "Then you should prepare yourself. This isn't going away." When I hung up, the quiet felt different, thicker, heavier. But beneath it, I could feel something solid, like the ground finally settling after a long tremor. 2 days later, Douglas called with updates from Florida. "The fraud hearing's been scheduled," he said. "We'll present everything: Ethan's statement, the forged documents, the payment trail." Her attorney's already in panic mode. I rubbed my forehead, a small ache forming behind my eyes. "And Mom, still siding with your sister," he said gently. "But that's not your burden to carry." That evening, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "Family doesn't sue family." The message itself was short: "Stop this before you regret it." No signature, no context. I stared at it for a long time, then dragged it into a folder labeled Evidence. By then, the fear that used to grip me had faded into something else entirely: resolve. The next morning, a courier arrived at my building with a package. Inside was a manila envelope marked with a Florida post date. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from my mother. The penmanship was elegant, the message anything but. "You've always had a fragile heart, Elizabeth. Please don't make this uglier than it already is. Melissa is family. Let it go before you destroy yours." There was no signature at the bottom, just a faint scent of her rose lotion on the paper. I folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and set it on the table beside my grandmother's photograph. "You'd understand," I whispered. The woman in the picture smiled back through the faded frame sunlight frozen on her cheek. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in the fight. That week passed in quiet routines. Mornings were spent in meetings with Douglas over video calls, afternoons sorting files, evenings watching the rain roll over the city. My art studio sat untouched in the corner of my apartment, brushes dry, sketch pads blank. Every time I tried to work, my thoughts circled back to the same question: how many times had I accepted less because it was easier than conflict? By Friday, Douglas called again. "She's hired a new attorney," he said. "They're requesting mediation." I laughed softly. "So she's panicking." "That's one way to put it," he said. "But listen, Liz, if this goes to trial, they'll drag up everything they can. You need to be ready." I took a breath. I've been ready for this my entire life. That night, I walked along the waterfront near my building. The air was sharp with salt and the faint hum of ships in the distance. I watched the water move under the streetlights, remembering the view from Grandma's balcony, the same rhythm, the same endless motion. Somewhere between those waves and the lights, I found a kind of calm. When I returned home, I opened my computer and reread every email, every statement, every document that proved what Melissa had done. The facts were clear. The truth was undeniable. But family doesn't crumble under facts, it crumbles under pride. I knew the next call would come soon, and when it did, it would be from someone desperate to protect the illusion that had kept our family together for years. It came the next morning, just after sunrise. The phone rang once, twice, then a third time. I answered without looking. Liz Melissa said, her voice unsteady. "Please, we can fix this. Just withdraw the report. I'll pay you back. I'll make it right." I stayed silent. "Do you hear me?" she asked. "You're ruining everything." I could hear her breathing fast and uneven. "This doesn't have to go public," she said. "We can settle it privately. No one has to know." I closed my eyes. It's too late for that. The line went dead, leaving only the faint hum of static. I stood there, the phone warm in my hand, watching the morning light spread across my apartment floor. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was the first time I could see it coming. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break, a small line of sunlight cutting through the gray. Somewhere beneath that light, the storm was just beginning to shift, and so was I. When morning came, I could still hear the echo of Melissa's voice from the day before, pleading and furious all at once. She wanted me to drop the case, to pretend none of it had happened. The words had carried desperation, but there was something else in them too, fear. I sat by the window watching the fog roll over the sound and realized that fear meant she finally understood the one thing she'd never believed before: I wasn't backing down. Douglas called just after 8. His tone was measured professional, but I could tell he was running on adrenaline. "Elizabeth, her attorneys reached out," he said. "They're requesting a negotiation before this goes to court." I stared at the phone in my hand. "Why now?" "Because they know we have everything he said. Simply. The forgeries, the bank records, Ethan's testimony. It's airtight. They're hoping to cut their losses." The rest of that day moved like a slow reel of waiting. I cleaned the kitchen twice, paced the apartment, tried to work on a new design for a client, but couldn't focus long enough to finish a line. Every few minutes I'd check my phone, expecting another call from Douglas or another message from Melissa. Nothing came. The quiet felt strange, like the calm before a storm that everyone knows is coming, but no one can see. That evening, Douglas called again. "Her lawyer's name is Daniel Wright," he said. "He wants to meet in person. They're proposing a settlement." I hesitated. "What kind of settlement?" "They're offering you a payout to drop the case and let the sale stand," he said. $150,000. I laughed softly, though there was nothing funny about it. "That's less than half of what she stole." "I know," he said, "but it's the first sign of surrender. Think it over." I didn't answer right away. After we hung up, I walked to the closet and pulled out the old wooden box my grandmother had given me when I graduated college. Inside were her letters, still smelling faintly of lavender and paper. I unfolded the last one she ever wrote to me. The words were simple, written in her soft cursive. "If I ever leave you something, it's not charity. It's a promise. A promise that you'll keep living boldly." I read it twice, tracing the curve of her signature with my thumb. That letter had carried me through grief once. Now it steadied me again. The next morning, I called Douglas back. "I'll settle," I said, "but only on my terms." He sounded cautious. "All right. What are you thinking for conditions?" I said. "First, she writes a notarized apology admitting exactly what she did. Second, she repays the buyers herself in full. Third, she sends a letter to our parents explaining everything. And fourth, she signs an agreement never to contest another inheritance from our family again." For a long moment, Douglas said nothing. Then I heard the faintest trace of a smile in his voice. "Poetic and precise," he said. "I'll draft it." When the meeting was scheduled, I didn't fly to Florida. Everything was handled through documents and signatures, the way my sister preferred things, clean, distant, without confrontation. Douglas kept me updated over the phone. Her attorney tried to push back on the apology letter, he said one afternoon, but I reminded him it's the key to your agreement. She's signing now. That evening, he emailed me the final PDF. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first line read, "I, Melissa Carter, acknowledge that I falsified legal documents related to the estate of Evelyn Monroe." Her handwriting looked smaller than I remembered, like she'd shrunk inside herself. I scrolled down to the signature and stared at it for a long time. The same pen pressure that once carved her confidence into every page now wavered, hesitant. I forwarded the file to Douglas, with a single line just as served. But the feeling that followed wasn't victory. It was something quieter, heavier. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, the city lights stretching across the water. The truth had finally been written down, but it couldn't erase what had been lost. The trust, the warmth the family I used to believe could be fixed if I just tried hard enough. 2 days later, Douglas called again. "It's official," he said. "The property's back under your name. Funds have been released to reimburse the buyers. It's done." I thanked him and set the phone down, then just sat there for a moment listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rhythm of traffic outside. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was the strange weight of closure, how quiet justice sounds when it finally arrives. That afternoon, my mother called for the first time since the settlement. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her voice. "Elizabeth," she said, her tone formal, careful. "Your sister told me everything." I waited, but she didn't continue. "Everything," I repeated. "Do you mean the part where she stole from me, or the part where she admitted it?" There was a long pause. "She made a mistake," Mom said finally. "She's paying for it now. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive her." I stared at the floor, tracing the pattern of the wood grain with my eyes. "Mom," I said quietly. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it never happened. You always have to have the last word, she said softly, and the line went dead. When I set the phone down, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Disappointed, maybe. Sad, certainly. But the anger had burned out, leaving only calm behind it. For years I had let their words define me, the emotional one, the dreamer, the child who didn't know how to be practical. Now the truth was on paper, signed and sealed. That label no longer fit. A week later, Douglas called again with one final update. "Everything's cleared," he said. "The condo's officially back in your name. What do you want to do next?" I looked out the window at the gray Seattle sky streaked with light. "Sell it," I said. Grandma didn't leave it for me to keep holding on. She left it so I could move forward. He didn't argue. "I'll start the process," he said. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The hum of the rain against the glass sounded softer now, like the world had exhaled. The next morning, I listed the condo. By the end of the week, offers began to come in. When the final sale closed, Douglas called to confirm the wire transfer. The number glowed on my screen, $350,000, but it wasn't the money that made my chest tighten. It was what it meant, proof that belief can outlast betrayal. That night, I opened a new document on my computer. At the top, I typed, "Evelyn Creative Studio." One desk, one idea, one dream that finally belonged to me. I worked late into the evening sketching logo designs, researching studio spaces, and outlining my first project. For the first time in years, every decision felt like my own. Outside, the rain started again, light and steady against the windows. I watched it trace silver lines down the glass and thought of Grandma's words, "Don't let life make you small." I whispered them once quietly, just to hear them in the air. The next chapter of my life was beginning. But before I could step into it fully, there was one more echo left to face the family I had spent my whole life trying to belong to, and the one unexpected gesture that would arrive when I least expected it. After the condo sold, the wire confirmation from Douglas felt almost unreal. The number on the screen didn't look like money. It looked like a kind of freedom I'd never had before. $350,000 resting in my account, clean and rightful. The number didn't make me feel powerful or lucky. It just felt like something I'd finally earned the hard way. I closed the banking app and stared at my hands. They weren't shaking this time. They were still as if the ground beneath me had finally stopped moving. The next morning I woke early. The light poured through the window in streaks of soft gold spilling over the boxes I'd packed for my new studio. "Evelyn Creative," I whispered, testing the sound of it again. My grandmother's name belonged in that title. It carried warmth, steadiness, and the quiet kind of courage I'd been chasing all this time. I signed the lease for a small corner space near Pike Place. Nothing glamorous, just a room with wide windows and good light. I brought my brushes, my grandmother's watch, and a single photo of us on her old balcony by the bay. Opening the door that first morning felt like stepping into a new version of myself. I could still smell the faint scent of fresh paint on the walls, the promise of something just beginning. I spent hours setting up shelves, pinning design sketches along the wall, and testing the light at different times of day. By late afternoon, I sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by papers and the soft hum of the city outside. It wasn't success yet, but it was mine, and that was enough. A few days later, I received a message from Douglas. "Everything's finalized," he wrote. "The court has closed the case file. Congratulations." I sent back a short thank you and attached a small watercolor I'd painted the night before, a pale horizon over the sea. He replied within minutes, framed and on my desk already. I smiled, the first real one in weeks. For a while, life fell into a steady rhythm. My days began with coffee and soft music, then hours spent sketching or meeting small clients who'd heard of my work through word of mouth. I didn't think much about Florida anymore. When I did, it wasn't with anger. It was like remembering an old scar that no longer hurt to touch. But one morning, about a month after the sale closed, a small brown package appeared on my doorstep. The handwriting on the label stopped me cold. It was my mother's. The return address was their home in Clearwater. I carried it inside carefully, setting it on the table as if it might break. For a long time, I just looked at it. The tape along the top was neat pressed flat with the same precision she used when wrapping Christmas gifts. Eventually, I peeled it open. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was my grandmother's silver watch, the one she wore every summer on the balcony. Beneath it lay a folded note in my mother's familiar handwriting. "She would want you to have this," it read. "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth." That was all. No apology, no excuses, just that one sentence. I turned the watch over in my hand, tracing the small engraving on the back. "The world is waiting." The ticking was faint but steady, like a heartbeat that had traveled across years and distance to find me again. I fastened it around my wrist and sat quietly feeling its weight settle against my skin. It didn't feel like forgiveness exactly, but it felt like a beginning. Later that week, Douglas called again with one final matter to close. "Melissa's lawyer reached out," he said. "She sold her house at a loss and filed for separation." I listened in silence. "Do you want to comment or pursue anything further?" he asked gently. "No," I said. "There's nothing left to pursue." We hung up and I sat by the studio window for a long time, watching the rain slide down the glass. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to look back. As the weeks turned into months, the studio began to fill with life. Clients came and went, small businesses, charities, local artists. I painted late into the evenings, sometimes losing track of time, until I'd see the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. The city outside my window no longer felt like a place I was running to. It felt like home. One afternoon, while organizing supplies, I found an old box labeled Florida. Inside were photographs and letters from before everything changed. In one picture, Melissa and I were teenagers standing in front of Grandma's condo, arms linked but eyes turned toward different directions. I studied it for a long time before slipping it into a drawer. I didn't need to throw it away. I just didn't need to display it anymore. By early spring, Evelyn Creative had grown enough for me to hire a part-time assistant, a quiet young woman named Claire, who reminded me a little of myself at 20. She was earnest, curious, always humming softly while she worked. The first day she joined, she noticed the watch on my wrist. "That's beautiful," she said. I smiled. It was my grandmother's. She nodded thoughtful, then asked, "Is that where the name comes from?" I nodded again. "Yes. Everything good I've done started with her." There were moments when I wondered if my mother would ever call again. Sometimes I caught myself glancing at my phone, half expecting her name to appear. It didn't. But I realized slowly that I didn't need her approval anymore. The silence that used to sting now felt like peace. A few weeks later, an email arrived from an art magazine featuring local creatives. They wanted to include my studio in their next issue. The thought of being photographed made me nervous, but I agreed. The feature ran under the headline, "Rebuilding Through Design." When I saw the published article, there was a quote from me that the writer had pulled from our interview. "Sometimes the hardest part of starting over isn't finding a new path, it's believing you deserve one." The morning it went online, I stood by the window of my studio, the sunlight reflecting off the watch face, and thought about how far I'd come since that first call from Douglas. The betrayal, the fight, the silence, it all felt like another lifetime. By early summer, I had a small team, steady clients, and plans to expand the studio into the space next door. I still kept Grandma's photo on my desk, her eyes bright with that same unspoken wisdom. Whenever I glanced at it, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. She hadn't just left me property, she'd left me proof that I was worth more than I'd been told. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Seattle skyline, I locked up the studio and stood outside for a moment. The air smelled like salt and rain, the streets buzzing softly with life. I raised my wrist and looked at the watch, the same silver face that had once caught the light of a Florida sunset, now shining beneath a Pacific one. I smiled and whispered, "I made it, Grandma." That night, as I walked home, I realized something simple and certain. The story wasn't about what Melissa had taken, it was about what she couldn't touch. And though I didn't know it yet, something unexpected was still waiting to arrive, something that would close the circle for good. It was late summer when the studio finally felt alive. The windows were covered in sketches, the shelves stacked with color samples and framed prints waiting to ship. The air carried the faint scent of paint and coffee, two things that had become the rhythm of my days. I loved the quiet before clients arrived, that half hour where the city outside was just beginning to wake and I could hear the soft ticking of my grandmother's watch on my wrist. Every morning that sound reminded me that I'd made it here on my own. Claire came in early one morning, balancing 2 paper cups and a box of pastries. Fuel, she said, setting them on the counter. She'd become like a younger sister in the months since she started Steady, thoughtful someone who didn't talk just to fill the air. As she unpacked the pastries, she looked up and smiled. "Your feature in the magazine brought in 3 new clients this week. People really love your story." I thanked her, though I still wasn't sure how to feel about that word story. It made what happened sound finished, like something neatly tied up in the past. But stories like ours never really ended. They just settled into quieter places. That afternoon, while I was sketching a mural concept for a local charity, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in months. It was Douglas. "Liz," he said, his tone calm but deliberate. "I wanted you to hear this from me. Melissa filed for separation last week. Ethan mentioned she's moving back near your mother." I sat back in my chair. "Did he say why?" "Not officially," he said, "but it seems like things fell apart after the settlement. Financial strain, maybe guilt. Hard to say." I thanked him, and after we hung up, I just sat there for a long time staring at the design I'd been working on. The lines blurred together, the colors losing shape. That evening, the Seattle rain came heavy and constant. I locked the studio early and walked home under my umbrella, the sound of water drumming softly above me. By the time I reached my apartment, I was soaked at the edges, the watch cool against my skin. I poured myself tea and stood by the window watching the streetlights flicker against the wet pavement. For months I'd imagined how it might feel to see everything come full circle, to know the truth had caught up to my sister, that the damage she caused had finally turned back toward her. But standing there in the quiet, I didn't feel triumph. I just felt still. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at my building cream envelope, my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. The return address read, Clearwater, Florida. My stomach tightened. Inside was a single page neatly folded. "Liz, I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did changed everything. I thought I deserved more because I believed I'd given more, but I see now how wrong that was. I lost everything trying to prove I was someone worth admiring. I'm sorry for the condo, for Grandma, for what I took from you. Please take care of yourself. Melissa." I read it twice, then set it on the table beside my tea. Her handwriting was smaller, almost fragile. It didn't sound like the sister who used to speak with certainty about everything. It sounded like someone who'd run out of certainty altogether. I didn't write back. Not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't reopen what time was finally beginning to close. Instead, I placed the letter in the same box that held Grandma's last note. Both pieces of handwriting belonged there together, the woman who taught me to rise and the sister who taught me to stop kneeling. Autumn came quickly. The leaves along the waterfront turned copper and gold, drifting across the sidewalks like slow-moving embers. Business was steady. Claire handled more of the administrative work, while I focused on the art itself, murals, logos, small campaigns that carried pieces of stories like mine into other people's spaces. Each project felt like a quiet conversation with the world, one that didn't need anyone's approval. One Friday afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the city, I received an email from a local foundation requesting a meeting. They wanted to commission a mural about community rebuilding, and the project would be funded in part by donations from small businesses around Seattle. I accepted, and a few weeks later, I stood in front of a blank concrete wall, brush in hand, watching the first stroke of paint meet the surface. The sound of bristles against stone echoed softly in the cold air. Claire snapped a photo behind me and said, "Grandma Evelyn would have been proud." I didn't answer, but I smiled, the watch ticking faintly beneath my sleeve. By December, the mural was finished, a swirl of color and light shaped around the words, "Begin again." When the city unveiled it, I stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching people stop to take photos. It wasn't about recognition, it was about return. Standing there, I thought about that condo in Florida, the years I'd spent feeling like the smaller, quieter sister. And somehow here, hundreds of miles away under a gray Seattle sky, I felt whole again. A few days before Christmas, Douglas called one last time that year. "I got a card from Melissa," he said. "She asked me to forward her thanks to you for handling things the way you did." I paused, then said, "There's no need." He chuckled softly. "I think she knows that." That night, as the snow began to fall over the city, I stayed late at the studio. The lights outside blurred through the frosted glass, and the hum of the heater filled the silence. I looked around at what this place had become, the work, the peace, the quiet kind of stability I never thought I'd find, and I realized this was the real inheritance. Not the condo, not the money, but the courage to start over and to keep building anyway. Before I left, I checked the mail slot by the studio door. Inside was a small envelope, no return address. I opened it and found a Polaroid, a picture of Grandma's old balcony taken recently. The railing had been repainted white, the potted lavender still blooming in the corner. On the back, in soft handwriting, were 3 words I remembered too. The photo wasn't signed, but I didn't need to ask. I placed it on my desk next to the photo of Grandma and me and turned off the light. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and endless, covering the streets in white. The past had finally stopped chasing me, and for the first time in a long while, I could see what waited ahead. Winter in Seattle had a quiet way of folding around the city. The air carried a soft chill, and the sound of distant ferries drifted through the morning fog. Inside the studio, the hum of the heater mixed with the faint scratch of pencil on paper. Life had settled into a rhythm that finally felt steady. Claire had hung the Polaroid of Grandma's old balcony on the wall beside my desk. Every time I glanced at it, the words on the back I remembered too seemed to echo something larger than forgiveness. By February, new clients kept the calendar full, and I'd hired a local carpenter to expand the studio workspace. It was hard work, but it felt like the kind of exhaustion that left you grounded instead of drained. One afternoon, while reviewing design proofs, my phone buzzed with a message from Douglas. "Call when you can, good news." I stepped outside into the cold air and dialed his number. "Liz," he said, the warmth clear in his voice. I just received confirmation. "The Florida property transfer is fully archived. Legally, this chapter is closed." I smiled, watching my breath fog in the air. Closed? I repeated the word, landing gently, like a book, finally finding its last page. That night, I stayed late at the studio, surrounded by sketches and soft music from the radio. The glow from the city lights stretched across the glass, and the silver watch on my wrist ticked softly in rhythm. I thought of Grandma and how she used to tell me that peace doesn't always arrive loudly. It often just walks in and takes a seat beside you. That night, peace finally did. Weeks passed and the snow melted into gray rain. One morning, Claire found a letter slipped under the studio door. The return address read, Clearwater, Florida, written in my mother's handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note. Elizabeth. Your sister is staying with me for now. Things have been hard for her. She told me about the letter she sent. I don't know what you plan to do next, but I hope you find it in your heart to stop fighting ghosts. Families make mistakes. Maybe it's time to rest. There was no anger in her words this time, just exhaustion. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the same box that held the others. For a long time, I stood there, my fingers resting on the lid. She didn't know that I had stopped fighting a long time ago, that what remained wasn't anger, but understanding. That afternoon, I went for a walk along the waterfront. The air smelled faintly of salt and cedar. I passed shops with fogged windows and people hurrying home under umbrellas. Somewhere nearby, a musician played an old tune on a guitar, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. The rain felt lighter that day. By early spring, the mural project had caught the attention of a local arts foundation. They invited me to a small community event to speak about creative recovery, how art could rebuild what was broken. The evening of the event, Claire helped set up a display table with framed prints and photos from the studio. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the small crowd gathered under the dim lights. I didn't prepare a speech. I just told the truth how rebuilding wasn't about forgetting, but about finding purpose after loss. The audience listened quietly, their faces warm and kind. When I finished, a few people came up to thank me. One woman, probably in her 60s, squeezed my hand and said, "You remind me of my daughter. She needed to hear this tonight." Later that night, as I packed up my things, I noticed the silver watch catching the last bit of light from the hall. I smiled to myself. Grandma had been right all along. Some things are meant to be carried forward, not left behind. A few days later, I received a voicemail from Douglas. His tone was lighter than usual. "Liz, I thought you'd like to know. Melissa's cooperation letter arrived. The final settlement records will stay sealed, but her notarized statement is part of the public archive. It means your name stays clear permanently. Congratulations." I thanked him and ended the call standing by the studio window as the rain tapped softly against the glass. Outside, a gull crossed the waterline, its reflection cutting a pale streak across the surface. It felt symbolic in a way that words didn't need to explain. Spring came early that year. The city turned green again, the markets reopened, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and tulips. Business at the studio grew faster than I could keep up with. Claire took over scheduling while I focused on the creative side, and soon we'd earned enough to hire a second assistant. Every morning when I unlocked the studio door, sunlight spilled across the floorboards, and I couldn't help but think how far I'd come from that morning in London when Douglas first told me the condo was gone. One Friday evening as I was closing up, Claire lingered by the door. "You know," she said softly, "I think your grandmother would be proud of what you built here." I looked around the studio, the sketches on the walls, the colors, the hum of life filling every corner, and nodded. I think she'd say it's about time. That weekend, I took a train north to a small town near Bellingham, where a client had offered to host a local art fair. The ride was quiet, the landscape unfolding in greens and grays along the coast. As the train curved along the shoreline, I saw a stretch of water that reminded me of the view from Grandma's balcony, still endless, carrying every reflection without breaking it. At the fair, I set up a small booth under a white tent, my artwork arranged in simple frames. People wandered through, stopping to ask questions or share stories about their own beginnings. One woman pointed to a painting of an open window over the ocean and asked, "What's the story behind this one?" I smiled. "It's about letting light back in," I said. She nodded as if she understood exactly what I meant. By the time the fair ended, the sun had dipped low behind the hills. I packed my things, loaded them into the rental car, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. The world outside the windshield looked calm and familiar, the kind of calm that stays. When I returned to Seattle that night, the studio was dark except for the glow from the street lamp outside. On my desk, the Polaroid of Grandma's balcony still rested beside the watch. I reached out and turned it toward the window, letting it catch the faint light. The lavender in the corner of the photo looked alive, almost new again. Justice had been served long ago, but it wasn't the paperwork or the settlement that gave it weight. It was the life that kept moving forward, the studio, the people, the quiet peace that filled the spaces where anger used to live. The next morning, a new email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "About the mural." I clicked it open. "Hi Liz, my name is Daniel Ortiz. My mother saw your mural downtown and told me about it. I run a community outreach program in Florida that helps families rebuild after hardship. I think your story could inspire some of them. Would you consider visiting to speak about your work?" I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair. Florida. The same state I'd sworn I'd never go back to. Yet somehow the timing felt right. I didn't reply immediately. I just looked at the photo on the wall, Grandma's balcony glowing under a bright sky, and whispered, "Maybe one last trip." When I boarded the flight to Florida that spring, the sky over Seattle was streaked in pale silver. I hadn't been back in nearly 4 years. The thought of returning made something in my chest tighten, but I told myself this trip wasn't about the past, it was about what came after. Daniel Ortiz had arranged for me to speak at a community event in Tampa, part of a program that helped families recover from loss and start over. It felt right to say yes, even if part of me still wondered what I was walking toward. The air in Florida felt heavier than I remembered, warm, sweet, touched with salt. As I drove from the airport toward the coast, I saw familiar signs and streets that carried ghosts of old memories. The closer I got to clear water, the quieter the world seemed to grow. When I reached the waterfront, I parked near the old marina and stepped out. The sound of the waves hit me, first soft, patient, unchanged. Daniel met me outside the event center later that afternoon. He was kind and grounded, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. "We don't need anything formal," he said. "Just tell them what rebuilding looked like for you." Inside, a small crowd filled the room, families, students, people who had lost homes, jobs, or loved ones. I stood behind the podium, the microphone low, and took a steady breath. I used to think justice meant winning. I began. That it had to be loud and public and clear. But sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes justice is simply getting to live your life without fear. The room stayed still as I spoke about the condo, about what it felt like to have something stolen, and to choose not to stay angry forever. When I finished, a woman in the front row stood and said softly, "Thank you." That was exactly what I needed to hear. After the talk, Daniel walked me outside toward the bay. The evening light was fading into gold, the same color I remembered from Grandma's balcony. "You did good," he said. "You reminded them that loss isn't an ending." I nodded, grateful for the quiet truth of it. Before heading back to my hotel, I drove one last detour to the neighborhood where Grandma's condo used to stand. The building had been repainted a pale blue, the kind that changed shade with the sky. I parked across the street, letting the engine idle. A couple stood on this balcony, talking softly, as the wind lifted the curtains behind them. I could almost see Grandma there again, her hand around a cup of lavender tea, her voice gentle as she told me not to let life make me small. I didn't stay long. Just long enough to whisper, "I kept my promise." Then I turned the car around and drove back toward the city lights. When I returned to Seattle, spring had taken hold. The studio smelled of fresh paint and rain. Claire had left a note on my desk that said, "Welcome home, boss." Underneath it, she'd placed a single sprig of lavender in a small glass jar. I smiled and set it beside the photo of Grandma. The silver watch on my wrist ticked softly, steady as ever. That night I stayed late cleaning brushes and sorting through sketches. Outside, the city moved like a slow current, alive but calm. I thought about Melissa, how she'd sent the Polaroid months ago, and how I hadn't heard from her since. Somewhere deep down, I hoped she had found her own kind of peace, because forgiveness, I'd learned, doesn't always mean letting someone back in. Sometimes it just means letting them go. By the time I turned off the studio lights, the sky outside had shifted from dusk to starlight. I stood by the window one last time, watching the reflection of the mural across the street, the one that said, "Begin again." It shimmered faintly in the glass, like a reminder written for anyone who needed it. I slipped on my coat and stepped into the cool night air. The city smelled of salt and spring, of things starting over. As I walked home, I touched the watch on my wrist, feeling the faint heartbeat of its ticking, and thought of all the places where courage had led me. Grandma once told me that justice isn't always about balance, it's about truth. And when you stand in your truth long enough, peace has a way of finding you. If you've ever had to fight for what was right or rebuild your life piece by piece, I hope you know this. You didn't lose anything that was meant for you. You simply cleared space for what's next. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that starting over is its own kind of victory. And wherever you are tonight, be gentle with yourself. You've already come farther than you think.